Welcome to the Brand Together podcast. Join host Brett Ryan to dive deep and go behind the scenes of successful brand partnerships. Featuring pros from every industry and vertical, from mega brands to startups and everything in between. The Brand Together podcast is essential listening for anyone interested in learning more about brand partnerships. Are you ready? Let's dive in.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Brand Together podcast. My name is Brett Ryan. I'm joined today by one of my favorite people, Mr. Matt Darrington. Matt is the owner and operator of a shaving company called Teton Shaves. A super successful small business. I've really admired what Matt's been doing with Teton Shaves for a long time, and invited him onto the podcast today to, of course, talk about brand partnerships. We'll let Matt get a little bit into this, but I just wanted to point out that there's a lot of folks who own or operate small businesses who aspire to participate in brand partnerships, either with bigger brands or maybe someone else in their space. And Matt has been relatively successful at that. And so we've got him on the podcast today to pick his brain. But before I say anything else, Matt, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about Teton Shaves, and let the audience get to know you a little bit.
Sure. First of all, I'll start by saying extremely successful is a very generous way to describe Teton Shaves. I feel like all business owners, there's always an element of hanging on by your toenails a little bit. And I certainly feel that there's a lot of ambiguity with Teton Shaves. It's out in the middle of nowhere, for me personally anyway, uncharted territory. And so it's scary, it's exciting, but it's one of those things you never feel like you're on top of it. And so You're always just, there's that scramble element. So you got to be a little bit scrappy, which I actually quite enjoy. But yeah, Teton Shaves, I make traditional shaving brushes and not all of the things that go along with an excellent shave, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But that it started as just a little hobby in my garage, and I chased that hobby and made it into something that was paying for itself, and then eventually to something that was profitable, which is a jump that a lot of hobbyists don't make, and I can totally understand why. There's a lot that goes into that jump, and it's a little bit scary. But I did that about 3 years ago, and have been chasing that avalanche ever since. Is that really, once you make those decisions, it snowballs a little bit.
Can you give us an idea of what is the volume of business you're doing? How long exactly have you been around? You mentioned it started as a hobby. Now it's a profitable thing. Just give us kind of some numbers and dates to help us understand. And the reason I ask that is we have listeners who own and operate small businesses, and sometimes they're very small. I'm talking like solopreneurships. I've got an Instagram channel with a couple thousand followers. I'm trying to do brand deals, right? And so help them understand kind of the scale of your operation. And I think that'll give them some good context for the conversation we're going to have.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good point. So Teton Shaves is largely a solopreneurship, I think was the term you used. And it's primarily me. On occasion, I do sub out some work to independent contractors for different elements of the business, but largely it is yours truly. But I started this business, we talked about like the hobby phase. So some of these answers are a little bit fuzzy because I started about 5 years ago, but really in earnest, it's been about 3 years now. And like I said, those first couple of years were pay to play situation. I was paying for all the materials and everything. And then eventually the business started paying itself. Like it was not profitable, but it was breaking even. And I was happy with that. But I really liked this idea of demand gen marketing, and I wanted to push that in my own small way. And so about 3 years ago, I started in earnest to make it a profitable business. And when I say profitable business, I'll share some numbers, and they may seem minuscule to some of your audience, I'm not sure. But for me, where it is a solopreneurship thing, and this was something that was a little side hustle, I'm actually pretty proud of these. But last year, we ended up with a net of about 70,000. And then this year, we're on track for well over 100.
Amazing.
And yeah, I'm pretty proud of that. It's been a lot of that has come from a few strategic moves that really allowed me to find what little demand was already out there and then cultivate that and expand that demand. That was a big thing for me. That's really what shifted from kind of part-time fun to full-time paying the bills kind of money.
Sure. I want to talk about some of the brand partnerships you've done. But before I do that, I want to ask you about Teton Shaves brand broadly. So you're in the wet shave space, right? Traditional shaving goods and supplies, traditional shaving brushes. And so when it comes to branding and making Teton Shaves distinct in that space, making someone who's looking for traditional shaving supplies choose Teton Shaves over the next guy or gal, how did you develop that brand? What do you lean into? Talk me through the high points and the hallmarks of the Teton Shaves brand.
Sure. So a lot of this came down to, obviously, I did some product market research. I was actually part of my own demographic, if you will. One of the benefits of being a traditional wet shaving enthusiast is you already have a pretty good finger on the pulse for what is already out there. And so I recognized that if this was going to be something sustainable, I needed to go the luxury route, not the utility route or something like that. And part of that really comes down to a very strong brand voice, a brand look and feel, and it needed to be on the luxury end. I recognized that there was a lot of this where I was only going to get paid if I was standing behind the lathe and turning brushes, and that there was a very severe bottleneck there, right? I can turn 1,000 brushes a year. That's maximum for me. And that's if I'm pushing hard. And so if that's the ceiling, then how do you increase revenue? And that is with margins, right?
Yep.
And so it needs to be in that luxury space. So you need to provide a bunch of value in the luxury, and a lot of that comes from the strength of the brand. So that's where, I don't know if that's what you're asking there, but that's business strategy there.
I love that you've unpacked the brand strategy a little bit for me, which is fantastic. Let me clarify a follow-up to that a little bit. So, for example, the company's called Teton Shaves. I'm familiar with Teton Shaves. I know, for example, that the branding for Teton Shaves leans into kind of this Intermountain West imagery, right? And I've been to some of the same wet shave events that you have and have hosted. You've got guys who have aliens or spaceships on their branding, right?
Sure.
You got people who have like sailors and naval imagery on their branding, right?
The tuxedos, the guys in the 3-piece suits and all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
And so tell us a little bit about, I'll just name drop here a little bit and say, I know that one of your premier products is what you call the Zen series, right? And so what I want you to unpack for the audience is talk us through the keynotes of the brand, right? What is the Teton? If someone asked, like, what is the Teton Shaves brand about? What would you tell them? And the reason I'm asking this is because my perception is that the actual brand story that you've developed, spoiler alert, I think it's part of what's been responsible for making Teton Shaves an appealing brand for your brand partners.
So yeah, Teton Shaves, we have a couple slogans, I should say. I'm not exactly sure what the term would be, but one of the things that I lean into is this idea of a connection with nature. I spent a decade as a fly fishing, not just a fly fishing guide, but in the fly fishing community as a fly fishing professional. And so this connection with nature was something that I felt very strongly about. It also helped that all of that stuff was in my backyard. So it was actually inexpensive and convenient to get pictures and videos and things like that. So it's like you when you're a small business owner, you use the tools that are available. And that was one that I understood in a very deep, meaningful way and was readily available. The other thing we lean into is this idea of mental health. The whole thing that got me in the shop in the first place was a desire to deal with some pretty severe depression and anxiety that I've had my entire life. I've dealt with that forever. And this is something that I talk about openly on my page, which is a hard thing to do. You're a little bit vulnerable there, but I think that's something that resonates with people. I talk openly about how depression is why I went out in the shop. 4 a.m, laying in bed, awake, worrying about finances and kids and school and career and all the things that a young dad worries about, led me to go out in the shop. And I started turning brushes. And that led me to my first signature piece, which was the Zen series. Brett mentioned that earlier. The Zen series is a shaving brush with a series of stacked rocks in the handle. And these stacked rocks, if you ever come across stacked rocks in the wilderness, out in Southeast Idaho or wherever you're exploring, you're intended to stop and take note of why they're there. They might mark an important change in the trail or a grave site, something of significance. And so you're supposed to stop and figure out why they're there. And the idea behind the Zen series was these are your own personal stacked rocks. Take pause, and what do they represent to you? Are they a commitment to mental health like they are for me? That's what my stacked rocks represent. Are they a commitment to sobriety? Maybe weight loss goals, maybe some sort of relation. Maybe you got out of a relationship and you want to remind yourself not to get into a place that's bad for you, or maybe you're proud of something and you want to remind yourself every morning when you shave of that thing. And that's what the Zen series was about. And I think you're right, Brett. I think when we talk about brand partnerships, that message is very prominent with Teton Shaves. And I don't know how to say this without sounding
no, go for it. Just say it.
But I think, I think it's pretty profound. I think it's something that a lot of people feel, not a lot of people talk about.
Yeah.
And so when brands have talked to me in the past, it's like they want to be a part of that.
Yep.
That's been a big thing for them.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that. And one of the things we know is one of the kind of branding 101, one of the key ideas is the brand, your brand, it's not necessarily what you state it to be, but it's what your customers and consumers perceive it to be, right? Your brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room kind of idea, right? And I love two things in particular about the Teton Shaves brand story. The first one is that items like the Zen series, they leave that door open for consumer interpretation, right? Where, what does this mean to you? And it allows customers to imprint their perception of your brand on the pieces themselves, right? And maybe it is someone who, whatever it is, you mentioned a lot of great examples of what that might be, but it can become theirs, right? And I love that. I think that's a genius branding maneuver. The other thing I really like broadly about the Teton Shaves branding is that this whole idea of mental health, I think that we have a bit of a mental health crisis in our country. I think particularly for men and boys, where it's taboo for us to engage with our emotions in a mature and healthy way a lot of times. And what you have here is you have a strong core element of your branding that is making that permissible and approachable for boys and men by presenting it in a very masculine wrapping, right? It's nature. It brushes shoulders with kind of the hunting, the outdoors, right? Kind of these traditionally masculine ideas and spaces. And I think the juxtaposition, or I guess the complementing of kind of the larger brand imagery and the focus on mental health is incredible. And for me personally, and I see others who are fans of your brushes and your brand, you can see people's appreciation for that in the way they engage with your products and your brand. And so I think that's fantastic. So with that being said, I would love it if, before I charge forward, you have any other thoughts on that at all?
No, I wish I could take credit for all of that. I have a business mentor of mine, and he said a lot of business is just throwing darts, and the more darts you throw, the more chances you have at hitting that proverbial bullseye. And with this one, everything seemed to line up. It was something I was passionate about, and I quite frankly just got a little bit lucky. It wasn't as strategic as all of that. It certainly is that, but I happened to luck into that. This wasn't because of my business chops, if you will. Just lucked into that. Actually, if I'm honest, and I've never told it this way before, but this is really where it came from. If you're familiar, I grew up LDS. That was a huge part of my life growing up.
So what is LDS?
Oh, yes, of course. Latter-day Saint, the Mormons, if you will, right? Grew up Latter-day Saint. My friends used to say that I was the most Mormonist Mormon that ever Mormon. That was me, right? And
Yeah, sure.
One thing I loved was the CTR ring. And the CTR stands for Choose the Right, and it's a little reminder that is very common. It's a little symbol in the LDS church. You see it on rings, you see it on shirts and all sorts of apparel and stuff. And the idea is wherever you are, you have this reminder of choosing the right, making the right choices, honoring the covenants you made or whatever that is, right? And I wanted something like that for me now. I've actually left the church, but I liked that idea, and I didn't want to leave all of the elements of Mormonism. And so this was my stand-in CTR ring, if you will. So the recipe was already there somewhat.
No, that's great. And listen, I don't want to get too deep into, sure. I think the overwhelming majority of businesses do not have calculated brand management, but you can see the natural evolution and the decision making, and there is deliberateness to it, which I think is a credit to you.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
So I want to dive in. I really want to pick your brain a little bit and lay bare for our listener audience just how exactly you court brand partnerships as a small business. And before we jump into that, I just want to ask you, could you talk us through just a handful, maybe the 2 or 3 that you're most proud of, maybe one that you're not proud of? Just could you talk us through just 1 or 2 of the brand partnerships that Teton Shaves has participated in?
Sure. One that I thought was fit like a glove, like it was just perfect. Some of these you're scrambling. It's a little bit of a stretch. Maybe the audience isn't quite compatible or whatever, but
Sure.
This one was about perfect. Aberlite Grooming Company, they sell beard products. Actually, it's primarily a B2B company, I believe. I'm not sure exactly. Most of their marketing would lead me to believe that this is largely a B2B company. They know that I work with a lot of barbers, and my products are used to take the hair off, right? Shave. It's a shaving brush, so it's intended to that you use it as part of a shave. Well, their products help maintain the hair that remains, beard or hair on your head. They've got straighteners and curlers and all sorts of stuff like that. And so it was like this natural, like I said, perfect fit between if you're a barber or if you're someone who's going to do this at home. You'll shave your beard, get it all looking nice, and then straighten it with their products. So shave it with mine, straighten it with theirs. It's like part of the complete breakfast, right? You have the complete nutritional breakfast rather than just one part or the other parts. It was like match made in heaven, right? It was about perfect. The other one was Razor Emporium, and they make something that I don't currently offer, maybe in the near future, spoiler alert, but at the moment, we don't have a razor. And a brush is worthless without a razor, just like a razor is worthless without a brush. So you have to have you have to have both in order to have the full experience.
Yep.
The reason I love working with brands like that is because it really helps me and my image. We talked about how that it needs to be luxury, right? And so when you use a Teton Shaves brush, I want the whole experience to be fantastic. And so whenever I sell one, I try to include all the things that I can to make sure you have the best experience with it. For instance, I'll include a coupon for a premium shave soap and a list of recommendations for excellent razors. Because in my mind, the worst thing you could do is get the brush and then get some really cheap soap from the big department store or big grocery store and have a terrible experience.
Sure.
Even if my product is great, if the adjacent ones are terrible, then it's the same as a bad experience, which is never something you want with the brand. So whenever I'm looking at a brand, another company to work with, that's largely what I'm looking for, is how well do you fit into this idea of a really luxurious experience?
Sure. No, I love that idea. The partnership principle you're keying into is what's known as hedonic symmetry. And there's this idea when you think about the hedonic elements of a brand, it's basically all of the when most people think branding, they think, oh, logos and typeface and margins and colors, etc. And the hedonic elements of the brand are essentially the non-visual elements of the brand, right? And so we understand that Teton Shaves is a luxury/premium brand. And so if any one of your brand partners provides less than a luxury or premium experience, that chips away at the premium and luxury elements of the brand. And I love that. You're being very deliberate and thoughtful about that because you don't want Teton Shaves anywhere near cheap soap that leaves your skin dry or scummy, or cheap razors that do more pulling than cutting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Or even cheap business practices too. If there's a brand, and I'm not going to mention what they sell or what they do or anything like that, but people largely despise the way that you need to do business with these people. And I'm very careful when I do choose someone to partner up with that their business practices are very similar to my own. Not that I think that my own business practices are the best or anything like that, but my audience will understand those business practices as important. Like, obviously, if they're buying with me and they like the way that I'm doing business, you don't have to buy a monthly subscription, or you don't, however you set that up, right? I think it's important that the people you, at least in this context, the people that you partner up with have something similar.
Sure.
Similar way of doing business.
It's like customers have expectations after doing business with you, right? If you're a Teton Shaves customer, you've ordered a couple brushes, you know what the packaging looks like, you know what the customer service is like, you know what the buying experience is like, you know what the unboxing is like. And if any part of that partnership throws a wrench in any of that, customers who are familiar with that premium experience, it's going to make their hair on their head stand up a little bit. And they're going to say, this doesn't feel right.
Yep.
This is tangibly worse experience than my other experiences with Teton Shaves, and I don't like it.
And I've actually been on the other side of that coin. There was a brand, she was a soap maker. I won't throw her business name out there, but she's one of the very, very few women-led shave soap makers, so it's not going to be hard to find who this is. But
sure.
She, in the early days of Teton Shaves, she came to me for a partnership. She wanted to do exactly what we're talking about. And at the time, I was so excited about it, and I just jumped at the chance. Yep, absolutely. And I just committed to everything, and I felt like I was punching above my weight class a little bit.
Sure.
She received the product back in its early stages with its recycled boxes, and the product was good, but everything around it was not. And she recognized that, and she said, I think we need to rethink this partnership. And I actually agreed. I said, yeah, now I understand what you and your business is all about. They are very premium. I thought, let's pump the brakes on this a little bit and maybe revisit this at a later date. Because her stuff was just this ultra premium stuff, and it wasn't the same as my kind of juvenile at the time packaging and branding and all that kind of stuff. So I have been on the other side of that, unfortunately.
Sure. And kudos to you for recognizing it, right?
She recognized it, really. But she recognized it, but I understood why. And I don't blame her a bit. In fact, we're still good friends. We talk on social media on occasion, and no bad blood there whatsoever.
Sure. I do think there's an awareness there. And I think truly, what's funny, I've interviewed close to 100 brand partnership managers now. And one of the more common threads I hear is that how easy you are to work with, how nice you are, how kind you are, the way you treat your partners is actually a big deal in brand partnerships. There are folks who have premium, just incredible brands that lose business because they're difficult to work with, or maybe they're a little less considerate of their brand partners. And so I think it speaks really well to your partnership management that you would see that. If she brought it up, you didn't push back, or you weren't a bad partner in that case. You said, hey, yes, I see it from your side. And I think that's a kudos to you. No company's perfect, no brand's perfect, but you can navigate the messy middle if you're willing to help other people accomplish the goals they have in the partnership. And so,
Yeah, I think when I first started out, I was always trying to reach for the stars with these brand partnerships and everything. I was really punching way above my weight class. And as I matured in business, I understood that this has to be much more symbiotic than what I initially was going for. Of course, I had the selfish mentality of like, how does this benefit me? I think the recipe for a really successful brand partnership is symbiotic benefit. Not if the scales are too out of balance, it just gets really tricky for someone to really commit to something if they're not seeing a lot of benefit from it.
Sure. Yeah, no, and vice versa, right? If you've got a partner who's really excited to work with you, but you recognize that if you're getting less from that partnership, the principle is called 1 + 1 = 3, right? And the idea is you've got two brands, right? And you've got so many hours in a day, so many resources, so much budget. And if the benefit of me engaging in this partnership is less than the benefit of me simply committing my resources to working alone, there's no reason to partner, right? It just, if 1 + 1 does not equal 3, there's no reason to partner. And I think you hit that on the head there. Let me ask you this. We've talked about a couple things that Teton Shaves has done well. We've talked about a couple things that we talked about a snafu you had and some things that at one point in time you wished you could have done better. Why do you believe that Teton Shaves has been an appealing partnership? You mentioned this woman approached you and said, hey, I like your brand. I want to partner. What is it about Teton Shaves that you believe makes it an appealing partner candidate for potential partners?
I think there's a couple different things. One is it's a really niche market. Just by being in that space, I'm automatically like going to be playing with these folks, right? I mentioned like being part of a complete breakfast, right? Shaving brush, shaving soap, hand in hand, right? And if you are making premium shaving brushes, which is an anomaly, then the people making premium shaving soap are going to want to talk to you. So I think that's one thing. But the other thing is, I think the branding, right? We talked about the emphasis on mental health and threading that needle of what you talked about, the masculinity, while still leaving some interpretation for some topics that are, I don't want to say taboo, but maybe something that's not, that everybody is sympathetic towards, but not a lot of people have talked about before. And a lot of brands, in my experience, want to attach themselves to that.
Sure.
I think it's something that they really like the message of the brand. They like the quality of the product. And that's something that they want associated with their brand as well.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I agree with what you said. I think there's these topics that are, it's like controversial is probably not the right word. I would say they're uncomfortable, right? And that's not because the topic is necessarily uncomfortable, but I think a lot, mental health, for example, There's varying degrees of even wanting to acknowledge that or talk about it. But that also creates an opportunity for a brand like Teton Shaves to be on the cutting edge of that. And it's a misstep that you see, I think a lot of bigger brands make, is they'll take these real ham-fisted attempts at some of these ideas. And when there's something like, so let's talk about mental health for a little bit. There's this meme on the internet of things that men will do other than go to therapy. And one of my favorite ones is men will spend every weekend. An example would be like, men will spend every weekend for 2 years building houses for the homeless, but they won't participate. This meme of they'll do this extreme kind of super extroverted, little zany, little dynamic hobby rather than engage in therapy. I don't want to get too much into the weeds with that, but that meme it indulges this cultural artifact of, okay, we're afraid to talk about this stuff. And so
that's the space Teton Shaves plays in. That's I have a gentleman I've worked with in the past, still work with today actually, but he told me about, I forget the term, something about red water marketing. I forget. Anyway,
red ocean or blue ocean.
Red ocean or blue ocean. Yes,
Yep.
Thank you. Yes, yep. I knew it was an industry kind of idea, but what I saw in this mental health space was an area where there were no sharks, but there was a lot of fish. Like mental health is ubiquitous. Like everyone knows someone, maybe they are someone who has some sort of interaction with mental health concerns, but seeing brands shy away from that, which I understand, it can be like a little bit of a tricky subject, and you have seen people absolutely fall on their faces trying to get into that space. But I think with a little bit of tact and understanding and empathy, it's something that can be navigated, and it's something I'm very passionate about. And so leaning into that was a no-brainer for me.
Yeah, I love that. And we could digress here big time. I want to ask you a couple more follow-ups about brand partnerships to comment on that one last time briefly. First of all, brilliant observation. Yeah, I don't think there's a lot of sharks, and I think it's just taboo, right? Perception is funny, right? And I want to digress just slightly, but I promise I'll tie it all back together. What I think it is, it's taboo to not project strength. Does that make sense? So you're a small business. My wife, she runs an online business, and you guys, even me right now with this podcast, I'm building a following. I'm building an audience. My wife is building an audience. You're building an audience. You've done a great job on TikTok. You're branching out to these other channels. But it's so funny because when it comes to social media and audiences, it's like it's high value to have an audience. It's low value to build one. Does that make sense? Because one projects strength and the other does not. And I think that tangentially relates here because it's high value to have good mental health. I think it's low value to acknowledge poor mental health and do the hard, dirty work of repairing it. Does that make sense? And for that
100%. Yeah.
And for that reason, I think a lot of these big brands, they want to latch onto the high value stuff, and they'll throw something out there and it'll just be incomplete and not hit the right notes and not actually be like a useful, tangible idea that audiences can attach themselves to and insert themselves into.
So yeah, 100%. The analogy that I think of with Teton Shaves all the time is I want to be like the rock star, right? Not me personally. I don't have any ego when it comes to that at all. But the brand, I want to be this brand rock star that also takes morning walks in nature for their mental health, which could you imagine, think of your, the heavy metal rock gods out there, and then imagine them spending an evening fly fishing and just appreciating nature or whatever. Like it's this strange thing. And I think that's the juxtaposition that we see with, like you said, building an audience is not powerful in itself, but having one is, right?
Yeah. Yep. No, I love it. Okay. So here's a question for you. And I realized we've already touched on a lot of this, but when you are evaluating brand partnerships. How do you determine whether the juice is worth the squeeze? What are the distinguishers between someone who you say, thanks, but no thanks versus, yeah, I'm excited to work with you?
Sure. You mentioned the 1 and 1 must equal 3, and
Yep.
that's really what it comes down to. Now, what metrics do you use to get one what plus 1 what equals
Yep.
3 what? And so that's what you really have to be clear on. And just because they're a great brand that has values that align with yours and the investment in time and resources makes sense or whatever, like it doesn't necessarily make sense. Like you have to look at that. And so for me, it all comes down to clearly identifying your metrics. Are we looking to generate revenue from this experience? Obviously, everything ultimately is going to go to a revenue goal, but I'm talking like very linearly. Are we looking for this to increase sales this month, this 6 month, next 6 months, next year, whatever? Is this going to be a reach? Are we looking to increase our audience? Are we looking to level up our brand image by partnering with someone who is really prestigious in whatever area you want that to be? So when you determine if it's worth the squeeze, it really comes down to identifying the metrics in which you are measuring the juice.
Can you think of a time where you weren't sure if the juice was worth the squeeze, and how did you proceed?
Yeah, there was a couple of them, and I won't use their names, but they were punching above their weight class a little bit with Teton Shaves. They were just starting out,
Sure.
and I was helping them. They were asking me some questions and stuff. I was helping them navigate some of the transition from one of the gentlemen was transitioning from Etsy to his own website and wanted to know some of the ins and outs of that. And so I was happy to help him. And then ultimately we partnered together for a collaborative effort. And I think ultimately what happened there was he got a lot of benefit out of it and I didn't get hardly anything.
Yep.
His audience was very small. My audience was relatively large. It's not enormous, but compared to this niche market, it's respectable. And anyway, ultimately what happened, what I was hoping would happen did not. I was hoping that there would be more overlap between our audiences, and there was not. And so it was a lot of give and hardly any take. And that was probably my bad, being a little bit too sympathetic with this small brand. I probably should have just passed on. Not probably, I definitely should have just passed on that.
Sure. But you execute and you learn, right? You're speaking to a principle, right? This is a core principle. It's the idea of aligning risks and rewards. And I'd be willing to bet, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'd be willing to bet that if a similar partnership opportunity presented itself to you today, you'd probably say, no, thanks.
Yep.
And
Probably. Yeah. The juice wasn't worth the squeeze. And initially, here's the thing though, when you're a small business, this is tricky because at one point during your small business, any juice is worth the squeeze.
Sure.
Like, it doesn't really matter. So you're like,
Yep.
yeah, I'll take any brand partnership. Yep. Give me anything at all. And so you have to this is something that I talk about quite regularly on my live show. I say that you need to be as a small business, solo entrepreneurship, that kind of idea. You need to be very passionate about your product and very sterile in your business choices. And so you need to have this very clear line. Okay, am I an artist today or am I a businessman? So you need to have a foot in each camp and then clearly make sure that the businessman is making the businessman decisions and the artist is making the artist decisions. And make sure that each one has just allowed a voice as the other.
Yep. No, I love that. There's a duality there, right? Especially when you're creating beautiful products like Teton Shaves. I wonder what that reminds me of, and what it makes me think of is they've got to rein each other in, right? A little bit. And I think I also wanted to mention that I think there's a useful idea to apply here in regards to aligning the risks and rewards, where you're totally right, especially when you're first starting out. It's I'll partner with anyone. Or if your brand or your business is at a stage where it hasn't quite identified like its ICP, it's not really truly dialed in on who its customer is, you're like, I'll throw spaghetti at every wall. And when stuff starts to stick on there. And so there's all these sub objectives, right? People say, I want anything because I just want exposure to a larger number of people. But there's all these sub objectives folded up, like identifying our audience, right? Maybe getting customer feedback to achieve better product market fit. Maybe it could this and this and that. There's all this due diligence that it's if I throw spaghetti everywhere, maybe I'll scratch towards some of those objectives as well. And maybe it does, but my perception is a lot of times when you do that, you can end up spinning your wheels a lot because you're not pursuing any of those sub objectives deliberately, right?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I've talked about this quite a bit as well, is there's always this idea that as a business owner, a small business owner, there's never enough time to do everything you need to do. And so the idea is just throw everything, just go for it, like wide open throttle. But if you don't have the luxury of being able to do that because you're so strapped for time, resources, whatever. Usually it's time for these types of ventures.
Yep.
And so you need to clearly identify these things. Take the time to discover your ICPs, do some market research. And that way, when you do have some efforts moving forward, you're actually moving forward and not just spinning around in circles, trying to find that vein of gold. And then also, you're not going to even be able to identify the vein of gold if all you're doing is just throwing darts in every direction.
Sure. And to bring this back to being a good partner, right? If you're fortunate enough to have someone approach you for a brand partnership and they turn it on you and say, what do you want from this brand partnership? And you say, I don't know, or just anything works, right? Whatever, like I'm down for anything. Like to me, that would say, suddenly I'm not so sure. How can I fulfill my responsibility to you as a partner and make sure that we're aligned on the value exchange if you don't even know what you want, right? And I think if you haven't done that due diligence, it dramatically limits your ability to actually be a good partner.
Yeah, I talked about one partnership that I did, Aberlite. They put a lot of trust in me. They were like, dude, we like what you're doing. Just take our products and do that same thing. And that made me really uncomfortable initially. I'm like, man, really? Is this? I would rather you tell me exactly what you want.
Yeah.
Now, luckily, it's been nothing but a great relationship and it's been wonderful. But that was, yeah. Now, when I'm working with bigger brands, they're a bigger one. I'm usually not too worried about that. The ones that freak me out are the smaller brands, because I know this means a lot more to you. Like when we're looking at like percentage of your marketing budget or whatever, this is a bigger deal for you than it is for a $200 million company or whatever to partner with me. So those are the ones that always freak me out a little bit. I always get really specific on what we're looking for in those relationships.
No, that makes perfect sense. You don't want to be a bad partner, right? Is what it comes down to. We've covered a lot of this just by osmosis, right? But I want to throw a question at you and give it a little bit of a more direct spin. So what practical advice would you give to a small business owner operator who is attempting to court brand partnerships? I think we've talked a lot about it right now. If you could travel back in time a couple of years and give yourself just some super practical advice, what do you think you'd share?
Sure. The first thing, if I could take Matt Darrington from 3 years ago and sit him down and say, okay, this is what you need to consider when looking at some of these brand partnerships, I would mention alignment of values. Make sure that what you value and what the brand that you're courting values is similar. Doesn't have to be identical, but like similar. We talked about that. The way that people do business with you needs to be somewhat similar or at least compatible with the way that they do business with this other brand. For your personal benefit, I would recommend audience compatibility. Is there an overlap? If there's not an overlap, is it still in the same space? So we mentioned with me in the shaving world, it's quite easy because I'm part of the complete breakfast. I'm not the whole thing. And so finding someone who gets a more complete, luxurious shave is what I'm after, right? So that kind of goes to the next one, which would be a strategic fit, right? How do their products, their brand, how does that fit within yours? You almost have to look at it as another product that you're offering, right? Does this mesh with what you are already doing? And so consequently, you need to be pretty resolved in what you are doing. Determine who are you? What is your brand? What is your brand voice? And do these other partners mesh with that?
There's this idea of understanding your brand's own equity, right? And I mentioned earlier where it's the inverse of what we just talked about, right? If you have a brand partner and they don't know what they're about, right? If they don't understand this idea that you just mentioned, who they are, what they stand for, that's very confusing to you as a partner, right? So it's like the inverse of that. The other side of that coin is if you don't understand who you are, it's going to make it confusing for you when you're trying to line up partners. And it's going to make it confusing for any partners you do manage to line up if you're not really clear on what your brand's equity is.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Which leads to my next point, which would be reputation and credibility. The brands that you partner with, at least in the luxury space, which is where I play, reputation and credibility are everything in that space. And so you want to make sure that the people that you partner with have a good reputation and are viewed as credible, legitimate businesses in that space. That one might be specific for Teton Shaves, but probably not. I could see that just about everywhere. And then lastly would be mutually beneficial. 1 + 1 = 3.
Yeah.
We need to make sure that makes sense, whatever those metrics are. If that's clicks, likes, shares, if that's sales, if there's a specific sales number that we're looking to get, if that, whatever the numbers are, you need to, first of all, determine what they are. And then second of all, make sure that both parties are able to deliver on that.
I think a lot of folks who, particularly those who are new to brand partnerships, will probably hyper focus on audience size, right? But the reality is that there's many tangible things you can pursue as a suitable outcome for brand partnerships that don't necessarily have to do with audiences. I'll give you an example. So when I used to work for a small SaaS company called LabStats, and it's a SaaS tool for university IT managers, kind of product that if you work there, you're never going to be able to explain to your grandma what you do, kind of thing. Very technical product, but LabStats was an 800-pound gorilla in its space, right? In its space, in its product niche, it was a fairly big brand name. And we were approached by a company that wanted to partner with us, and they were largely based in the UK. At the time, our customer footprint was largely based in the US, and our customer base dwarfed theirs. We had, several multiple times over the number of customers that they did. But because they were so well positioned in the UK, we legitimately entertained and engaged in a few brand partnerships with them just to gain better access to that market. And that's a perfect example of, it's not always about, you don't always need a bean counter verifying that the exchange is exactly equal. There's other things that you can offer depending on how you're positioned, right?
Yeah, I think that's what makes Teton Shaves valuable for a lot of other brands. This super niche audience that's hard to reach. It's in that kind of treacherous waters of mental health that a lot of brands don't feel comfortable diving into. But if I'm already there and they can partner with me, even though it's a smaller audience than what they have, or like you said, this company in the UK, that is where I see Teton Shaves, the benefit of Teton Shaves in the relationship. In some of these relationships, sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes I'm the big fish and they have the niche market or whatever. But in a lot of these bigger ones, like sometimes I'll have people who are also in this same space. Dude, you're partnering with those guys. How'd you land that deal? And that's why it's your unique position in the market can be something that's extremely valuable to other brands. Not just the quantity of your followers, not just the size of the audience necessarily.
Yeah, I wouldn't quite call it a principle, but there's definitely this idea of, with like very few strict exceptions, I think there's this principle of, if you build an audience, it's valuable to someone somewhere, especially if they're highly engaged with your brand and love what you do. And yeah, I love that. Okay, Matt, we are about out of time for today. So let me just say thank you for coming on. It's been a pleasure. You've been a treasure trove of insights. On our way out, why don't you just tell the audience who you are, what you do, where can they find you? What are you working on that you're excited about right now? Give us your socials. Just let people know how to find you and what you're working on.
No, man, I appreciate the opportunity. This is stuff that I'm really passionate about that I don't really get to talk about a lot on my channel. So yeah, thanks for the opportunity. I truly appreciate that. Teton Shaves is found pretty much anywhere you want to look. YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. But the biggest and most active channel there is TikTok. I'm very active in TikTok so long as that is an available channel, with the future of which remains to be seen. We'll see what happens there, but as it's available, I go live every Thursday and Sunday evenings from 8 to 11 Mountain Time. Come into the shop, hang out. We talk about marketing. We talk about mental health. We talk about traditional wet shaving and a lot of the current topics or anything that's top of mind. It's my come and hang out with us venue, really casual and fun. Apart from that, check out TetonShaves.com. That is the only channel that I sell my brushes in, apart from a few wholesale locations across the United States. And feel free to reach out with any questions with traditional wet shaving, lathe work, anything like that, future brand partnerships, whatever. I'm very responsive on all of those channels. So more than happy to help any way I can.
It's been a pleasure to have you. And thanks for sharing your knowledge with us. And that is it for today.
Thanks, Brett. Appreciate the opportunity, man.
Yep. We'll talk again soon for sure.
This has been another episode of the Brand Together podcast with your host, Brett Ryan. Join us next week for another deep dive into brand partnerships.